It's my pleasure to reintroduce to you Naomi Ruth Lowinsky, who you already met because she introduced all of us. Naomi is a psychologist and a analyst member of the Jung Institute here. She's taught for many years, and her two hats that she wears, or among her two hats that she wears, is she's a well-respected analyst in the community, and she's become a well-known poet, both in the community and beyond. And she has an ongoing poetry writing seminar or workshop here that's, I think, full. It's hard to get into. Yeah, there's a waiting list. That tells you something about the quality of the work she's doing with people, and also about the fact that this mythopoetic level that we keep talking about still is alive and well in the culture, and that's very gratifying. Naomi is the author of 3 books of poetry, and the one most recent one is called Adagio and Lamentation. And she also wrote a memoir called The Sister from Below, When the Muse Gets Her Way, which is about perhaps Naomi and her own version of Chutter, somebody who makes demands on her but also enlivens and enlightens her. And she's the co-editor, along with Patricia Damry, of Marked by Fire, which are stories of the Jungian way. And last of all, her most recent book is called The Faust Woman Poems, which is about her experience in the women's movement in the 1970s. So it's my pleasure to welcome Naomi Ruth Lowinsky.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yes, ma'am. We hear you loud and clear.
Great. Terrific. Well, thank you all again for your presence. So this is called Clinging to the Axis Mundi, the Poetry of Politics. Not words you usually hear together. Writing poetry is an essential and organic process for me. Jung writes, "The creative urge lives and grows like a tree in the earth." I know that feeling. Writing poetry is how I plant myself on earth. The leap of associations from conscious mind to unconscious and back, that is the magic of a poem, is how I find my way back to the center, to the archetype of orientation, the Axis Mundi, which also is the North Pole, that's no star, which we recognize in many forms, among them the tree of life, which we see over here, or world tree, the 7 chakras, the mother line, the ladder between the worlds, the sacred mountain, that old black magic that connects us to the cosmos, whose wisdom goes back to the origins of our kind. I believe it is the essential work of poetry to reach back to the roots of human consciousness and retrieve our collective soul. I believe poetry is a way to bring ourselves back into relation with our old black magic, the sun, moon, and stars, animals, plants, ancestors, the Axis Mundi. Now this is Yggdrasil. This is the great ash tree that holds together earth, heaven, and hell by its roots and branches in Norse mythology. But how can poetry respond to the rancor, the bitterness, the extremism, the climate change deniers, the New Deal dismantlers, the women's rights plunderers, the hellish intensity of our collective moments? Poetry is no more than the flap of a butterfly's wings, the dart of a hummingbird, a strophe flung into the roar of the mob. Poetry does so little, dares so much. Poetry is the prophet down from the mountain, a gadfly on the body politic, a witness to the desecration. Poetry sings our cultural myths, mourns what's been lost, praises the newborn day. When the political leaps into my poems, I am surprised and actually grateful. As an introvert, I mostly meet my muse in inner worlds. But sometimes she startles me with some iconic collective image or jumps on me with fierce associations to the news of the day. Disturbing as the news may be, such visitations from external reality feel numinous and strangely orienting. Something shifts in the imaginal realm. That's the realm we just heard about from Richard. My spirit settles down. My soul finds the stairway between the worlds. I have chosen 5 poems that take very different slants on the political. I'll say a little to introduce the poem, then read it, accompanied by its images, and muse about it. Before I go any further, I just want to say parenthetically, as I'm trying to see my daughter's face over there, that I really want to thank her. She helped me with the PowerPoint, and Dan, my husband, who's helping me right this moment with the PowerPoint. This is a brand new thing for me to do, and I got very excited by all the images, as you can tell. I went image crazy. I couldn't have done it without Shanti and Dan. Recently, while meditating on mortality, which is familiar turf among poets, I'm sure you know, the elegiac phrase, "when I'm gone," brought an entirely unexpected visitation from Adlai Stevenson, a powerful figure in my childhood. Suddenly, in a short poem of 22 lines, I was off and running through the political firestones those of us who were children in the 40s and 50s remember well. The poem touches the hot spots of my being, like the hot spots in the woman and her chakras. It is a totem pole of my tribal associations. Here's the poem. When I'm gone, who will remember a girl's crush on Adlai Stevenson? The earnest precinct walks, the beloved silver lapel pin, a shoe with a hole in its sole, meaning eggheads are lovable. Remember Einstein's mismatched socks? Who will remember the violet glow of Oma's eyes, telling tales of Erich, the dying tiger in the Berlin Zoo? His throaty greeting each time she came to paint him, before she knew she was marked a Jew. Who will remember how safe it seemed in America? The war was won. The streets were calm. A child could play cowboys and Indians all day until dusk. How green the lawns, how sweet the smell of honeysuckle. Before the House Un-American Committee, before billy clubs and dogs, before 4 little girls in church, before Howl, who will remember her skinny little girl's body before breasts had their way and nothing was safe anymore? The poem I just read plants the totem pole squarely in my personal life and my projections on the body politic. When I was 8 and 9, my family lived in Princeton and knew Albert Einstein socially. He was a member of our tribe of refugee Jews from Hitler's Europe. We were all aware that he was under surveillance by the FBI because of his courageous stands against racism, McCarthyism, and war. My grandmother, whom we called Oma, was an artist. She taught me that making art is a way to stay connected to one's depths through treacherous times. She did the sketch of Einstein you see. She also did the painting of the tiger at the Berlin Zoo. My brothers and I loved to hear her stories of how Erich the tiger, at the end of his caged life, would greet her with a soft, guttural grrr as she approached with her easel. When I was 13 and my family lived in Berkeley, my best friend Kathy and I were passionate precinct walkers, wearing the beloved silver lapel pin, in love with Stevenson, who was our good father, the kind and thoughtful egghead, unlike our own rageful and dangerous egghead fathers. Stevenson was the egghead's culture bearer. He spoke for our tribe of intellectuals. When he lost his second election, it seemed as though the world had collapsed around our young ears. Kathy and I were also passionate protesters against the House Un-American Activities Committee. We were among those in the iconic photo being hosed down the steps of San Francisco's City Hall. You can see us on the left here. That's Kathy, that's me. being washed down the stairway. It seemed as though our America was being lost. Allen Ginsberg, in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets, howled our collective rage. Who carries that voice today? Some of these poems are hard for me to get through without crying, so I hope you'll forgive me if I do. In the run-up to the Iraq War, I had a motherline moment at an anti-war demonstration. The motherline is the connection between women over generations, which I wrote about in my first book, The Motherline, Every Woman's Journey to Find Her Female Roots. The motherline, as I envision it, and as my friend Sarah Phillips Spalding has painted it so beautifully for the book's recent reissue, is another form of the Axis Mundi. It is called The Mother Tree of Life by the Makonde in Africa. On that day, in January 2003, my daughter, not this one, my other daughter, was going into labor, and I kept in touch with her by cell phone during the demonstration so I could participate in this outer world event and still make it to my grandson's birth. Suddenly, I was rocketed back in time to another demonstration, this one against the Vietnam War, with my daughter in a stroller. Here is the poem. Emmanuel. On the day you descended into our world, circles within circles opened. 150,000 people marched up Market Street to protest a wrong war. Not in our name, not in your name, Emmanuel, they chanted. And the drag queens of the city came out beautiful in their highest heels, their sleekest black velvet. And they thanked us so much for coming out to say, no blood for oil. War is not healthy for children and other living beings. And an old man on rollerblades gave yellow roses to the little girls, and a woman bared her very pregnant belly with a peace sign painted upon it. And I spoke every hour on my cell phone to your mother to find out how close were her pains. It was a few hours before your dark head would crown, your broad shoulders twist out, and that glistening coil of your cord from the other world which your father cut, while your mother cried out to behold you, old wisdom still clinging about you. Emmanuel, it was the day after the full moon in Capricorn, and the people had awakened to the gathering armies, the gulf upon which we all teetered, and returned to the streets as we had when your mother was my baby girl, and we walked up Market Street to protest a wrong war. Emmanuel, you have descended, and the world is so new. Your first poop is big news, and your good latch upon your mother's breast. You are so sweet, so calm a being, released from forever to sing among us. Little house of God, may we deserve you. And this is a painting by Mary Cassatt. The collision of a birth and a war is a story I trace back in my life to when I was a very young woman, newly married, beginning to realize that I was pregnant. It was in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it seemed that human life itself hung in the balance. My own birth, as the first child born to my family in the New World after the Shoah, the catastrophe that befell my people and many in my family, holds these opposites as well. I'm sure that my political fixations have much to do with this aspect of my destiny, this culture complex, to borrow from Tom. I grew up among people who were constantly scanning the horizon for the next Hitler. That I should live to have grandchildren, who would have believed it? Emmanuel, better known as Manny, is now a thoughtful 9-year-old who seems firmly planted in his own axis mundi, which, to my bemusement, takes the form of a golf club. He's a passionate little golfer. This is called Follow the Drinking Gourd. It's the cover image of a children's story by the same name. It is written and illustrated by Jeanette Winter, published in 1992. Many of you may know that that wonderful song, the spiritual Follow the Drinking Gourd, is actually directions for how to get to freedom, how to get to the north. November 4th, 2008, Barack Obama's election was a peak experience in my political life, maybe in yours as well. All my childhood Einstein and Adlai Stevenson yearnings came out of the closet and sang. It was as if we'd followed the drinking gourd all the way to freedom, as if the stairway to heaven was illuminated. As if the chariot had come to carry us home. And this amazing painting is called Swing Low, of course, and it was painted in 1937 by John McCready. He lived from 1911 to 1968, an African-American painter from New Orleans. If you look at it carefully, you can see there's somebody dying in the house here. And then there's all of this energy coming down from the heavens. Looks like him. Yep, that's the devil. Somebody pretty powerful and satanic. I'm losing my headphone here. Okay. The muse came to me in the guise of Obama's white grandmother, who had helped raise him in Hawaii and who died just before his election. I think he was just graduating from high school when that picture was taken. And that's a picture of him learning of his grandmother's death, which was just a few days before the election. The poem is in her voice. It's called Madeline Dunham, Passing On. And I have an epigraph from a Bushman legend or poem that San people, which goes, a wind blows when we die, for each of us owns a wind. I never knew I'd be wind when I died, a warm wind on my way home from the islands, a light breeze off the lake, breath in my grandson's lungs as he speaks to the crowds on this, his election night. Does he know this is me touching his face and the faces of those who never believed they'd see the day? Who'd have thought I'd be breath in the bodies of so many strangers? Who'd have thought I'd be music, sweet as the sound of the slack key guitar? Or that I'd become an ancestral spirit in the land where they know how to feed the dead? They're roasting 4 bulls, 16 chickens, some sheep and ghosts to feast the one who belongs to us all, to the Kenyan village of his grandmother Sarah, to the spirits of his father and mother, his black and white grandfathers, to the ones who are laughing and crying in Grant Park. In the land of the dead, nothing is over. We still wander, still worry, take pleasure, make trouble, demand our portion of beer, of drumming, of dancing all night. I say to you living, though I've drifted away, though I'm only a sigh, an exhalation, I can feel your whole world shift, though I'm only the far-away sound of a slack key guitar. It happens that the Jungian International Congress was held in Cape Town, South Africa, in August preceding the election. My husband Dan and I had been there and were steeped in the politics of South Africa and its rich lore and culture. I had read wonderful poetry based on Bushman legends and been fascinated by the notion that we become wind when we die. Africans were so excited about Obama. Dan brought some Obama bumper stickers with us, and they earned us a free pass at the airport when our luggage was overweight. Celebrating the election of a president who had both American and African ancestry was a transformative moment in the life of the country and in my personal life. Now here's another very different Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. This is a lithograph by Ruth Starr Rose, who lived a long life from 1887 to 1965. She was a white woman with a social conscience. She was moved by the power of religion in black people's lives. And this is one of a series of lithographs she did depicting spirituals. So it's typical of my muse that even in a moment of elation, she shows up in the form of a ghost. Like Jung, who writes, "Take pains to waken the dead," relating to personal and collective dead is an essential practice for me. I saw this in another light recently when I went to see the remarkable exhibit 1968 at the Oakland Museum with my husband and son. We stood, tears in our eyes, with a young black man whom we did not know, watching a film of Robert Kennedy's casket passing through the American landscape, greeted by mourners of all races and ages. The young man said he was 2 when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, that RFK was his hero. I reflected on how Obama's election tied us back to the unbearable year when not only Robert Kennedy, but Martin Luther King were killed. I hope their ghosts were dancing on Election Day 2008. Another connection came to me while wandering through that exhibit, and this is it came to me very strongly because my husband Dan was a delegate at the 1968 Democratic Convention and was out in the streets when the streets went crazy. During the Democratic Convention, Grants Park is where a group of protesters against the Vietnam War were tear gassed. 40 years later, it's where Obama, newly elected, gave his speech to the crowds. What a transformation. Now this is Mount Kailas. It's a Himalayan peak in contemporary Nepal. And it's just a beautiful image I don't really quite know where it comes from. These things show up online, and it's hard to figure out where they're from, but I love it. So as we all know, those moments of delight and joy after the election did not last long. We were soon plunged into a period of bitterness and disappointment for those of us who had big expectations for Obama's presidency. We thought we had climbed the mountain. Suddenly, we found ourselves lost in the valley of the shadow. The voices of the climate change deniers, the women's rights plunderers, and other extremists filled the airways and confused our sense of direction. Who are we as a nation? Where are we going? What happened to the wisdom of Einstein and Stevenson? The mountain spoke to me one winter day in the midst of the rancor and frustration. Mountains have always been sacred to me. They are the form of the oxus mundi in which divinity reveals itself to Moses, to Martin Luther King, to my grandmother who painted them beautifully, mostly in Switzerland. Jung says of the mountain that, quote, it stands for the goal of the pilgrimage and ascent, close quote. I live near a mountain I love, Mount Diablo. The mountain gave me this poem. Because the mountain is my companion. Because it meanders from coyote yellow to occasional green. Because we know that temperatures are rising. We never expected this sudden freeze. Because the mountain reached into cold, wet skies this morning and gathered itself a celestial garment of snow, as though it had ascended, become an Alp, a Himalaya. Because my tawny old devil mountain is a suddenly wild thing of snow and of ice, I try to put these things together. How green the hills glow along the freeway. On the news, the leaders of nations gather to argue about carbon footprints. While in the city, dozens of red and white Santas, mostly without umbrellas, are gathering in United Nations Plaza. Because the North Pole, where Santa makes gifts, is under water, and the great white bear has walked to the end of his melting world. Because all our lives there's been some catastrophe just behind us, just before us. You could hide under your desk, protect the back of your neck. Or you could get back in your get in your car and drive back to the mountain, which has descended to its essential coyote yellow, its occasional splashes of green. Because the mountain knows the eons in its bones, it is a patient, broad-shouldered bearer of wind, sun, rain, change. I ask it to teach me the long, slow way. It always surprises me how the associative leaps of a poem combining conscious and unconscious, not unlike those made in an analytic hour, make deeper sense of things than can the conscious mind alone. Those of you who know San Francisco are likely familiar with the strange winter ritual in which folks dress up like Santa Claus and go bar hopping. The sight of San Francisco's charming eccentrics leapt like a mountain goat in my imagination to Santa at the North Pole, to melting ice caps and the fate of the polar bear, to the duck and cover terrors of my childhood. When I was looking online for images of kids getting under desks in the 50s, I was horrified to run into Bert the Turtle, an official civil defense film directed at children, which informs us that, and I quote, "Children need to learn to duck and cover, get into their shell like Bert the Turtle, because the atomic bomb, like fire, is very dangerous. There's a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you have ever seen. The flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time, but if you duck and cover, you'll be much safer." End quote. Really? I remember how absurd it seemed to me to put a wooden desk between me and an atomic bomb. I remember how terrified we were doing those drills, and how our teachers and the duck and cover propagandists seemed monstrously inept at best and liars at worst. These days, as I listen to my grandchildren, I realize they have their own version of these terrors. Growing up in California, they are lucky to learn about ecology and the biosphere in school, but they live with a sense of impending disaster. They worry about the polar bears and about the warming climate. They hear the grown-ups rant about the climate change deniers, the lack of political will to address the terrifying issues our planet faces. They wonder, as we all do, about their futures. My hope is that their amazing technological and ecological intelligence will find as yet unknown ways to protect and bless our Mother Earth and the sacred mountain. I pray they will have patience for the long, slow way. I'm a member of a generation of women whose lives were transformed by the women's movement and by the goddess. They emerged together, the spirit of the women of our times and the spirit of the forgotten great goddess ripped us out of our narrow, domesticated self-images, opened all 7 of our chakras to the wild worlds within us. But, as the myth tells us, eating the forbidden fruit of the tree has unexpected consequences. A lifetime later, I look back on all this and marvel. This is the poem that came, and it's part of the new collection that will be published next year, which Richard mentioned, the Faust Woman poems. And the poem is called Sisters of My Time. What became of our fierce flowering? Don't you remember how that old black magic revealed herself to us, gave us the fever, the crazy nerve to burn bras, leave husbands, grow animal hair? We knew her belly laugh, her circle dance, her multiple orgasms. It was our period. What became of us? Our period long gone, stuck in traffic jams, eaten by Facebook, gone stale amidst the unwept, unsayable. Some of us burst our vessels. Some of us descended into cellars, ghosts among the apricot preserves. Meanwhile, our bones thin, our skin loosens, our hands can't handle a mason jar. And our Red Queen, what of her? Her rainforests are bleeding out. Her corn won't tassel. Her cattle are dying of thirst. Her ivory-billed woodpecker, that God Almighty bird, has not been heard for a generation. Our Lady of Ripening's gone on a rampage. She's hot flashes in the heartland, fire in the forest. Flood in the bayou. Weeping ice caps. Our grandchildren starve for her belly laugh, her circle dance. It's our time, sisters, to gather what spells we know, what seeds we've cultivated, what oracle speaks in our dreams, for the root cellars of memory, the mason jars of prayer, emergency rations for the daughters of our daughters, long after that old black magic has spirited us away. Things haven't exactly worked out the way we thought they would in our young goddess-worshiping days. My generation has had to face the dark side of the goddess, her rages, her fire and flood. Perhaps she has come back to our consciousness now because we need the depth and breadth of all she is in order to hang on to the Axis Mundi. We need to remember our ancient knowledge, our seed-gathering motherline knowledge, our tree goddess serpent knowledge, our body knowledge, the wisdom of the chakras, that old black magic of the forest, the moon, and of Stonehenge. My generation of women reopened the floodgates to female creativity. It is our task now, late in life, to bring the arts we've cultivated as offerings to the work of retrieving our collective soul. I want to close with the image with which we began. A luminous tree of life crowned by an eclipse of the sun. It is by Aloria Weaver, a contemporary visionary painter and a member of a new generation of artists whose work we all need to bring us back to the center, to the roots of our humanity, to the Axis Mundi, the tree of our lives. Thank you. questions, comments, poems, images? Yes. Tom. Oh, thank you.
So glad that sort of to this citizen dilemma, political layout, that you brought your voice, because it's something we never hear.
Thanks, Tom. What? Oh, I'm sorry. This is for those of you in the webinar. Tom Singer just paid me a really nice compliment, saying that he's very glad that I brought my voice and of poetry to the politics that we're in, because it's a voice that's not heard at all, you were saying. Yes.
Basically, I thought about this recently, perhaps some of the people in the public policy, right word?
Polis. Yeah.
Who have a sense of literature and poetry, because I just thought of my only memory of it, 21 years later after Kennedy, he was in the speech of
Jack Kennedy, or yeah, Jack Kennedy. Mm-hmm.
It would be nice to see people in the public reaching out.
Obama has a very, very fine literary sensibility, but he doesn't use it very much because he's wanting to look like, you know, a common man, an ordinary man. But he's a fine writer. Oh, I'm sorry. That it's a comment. It's a comment that it would be nice if there were more literary types or literary sensibility among politicians. And the questioner was remembering Jack Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and the days when people were more accepting of literacy, I guess. And when it wasn't a dangerous thing to look too literate, as I think it is today. Yeah. Yes, Steve. Thank you. Oh, that sounds marvelous. Yeah, Steve's comment is about a program he saw on National Public Radio, or the television, right, PBS, which was Ethel Kennedy being interviewed by her daughter, with whom Ethel was pregnant when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. I mean, that's a motherline story if I've ever heard one. And then Steve went on to say that at the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and I remember seeing a film, Dan and I saw a film about this, it was so moving, Robert Kennedy spoke to the crowd and told them that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, and he quoted Aeschylus, and it's a marvelous quote that I can't really even get the gist of it, but it's sort of referring to this notion of literacy and the profundity of being able to speak out of soul. And the thing that happened, that was the city that did not explode. I don't remember which city that was. it was Indianapolis. It didn't explode as so many other cities exploded after Martin Luther King was assassinated. I can't recommend this exhibit, 1968, for those of you who can get to it in Oakland enough. Did you see it, Margaret? It is so powerful, and you get these moments that changed all of our lives. They're so powerfully depicted. Richard.
Naomi, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the images and poetry. You're showing at least Stevenson brings back many memories from my childhood growing up. And I think one of the terrible things we've lived through is the denigration of intelligence. Yeah. And the dumbing down of the educational system, the populist level of political discourse. And Stevenson was kind of a turning point. Somebody else who passed away just recently was the governor, who also was a true doctor. So I think we're mourning when we remember them.
Yes, Richard just said that that my showing the image of Adlai Stevenson brought back a lot of memories for him, and the sense of a time in this country when intelligence was respected, and how much that has changed, how much it's now denigrated, and the dumbing down of the school system and of the general collective noise around us all the time. And he also mentioned McGovern, who just recently died, who ran for president, who was a true dove and was fighting against the Vietnam War. Anything? Yes. Thank you. The question is about, she said that my presentation had a lot of the sacred in it, and that it strikes her that motherhood is a way to be connected to the sacred for many women. Did I get that correctly? You know, that was my book, The Motherline, and I wrote it when I was making the shift from having been a mother very young in my life and raising 3 kids and then remarrying and helping to raise 3 others, to wanting to be able to focus more on my own creativity. And what I was thinking about at the time was that, you know, for women, the power of the creativity of becoming mothers is so powerful. And it is a form of being connected to the numinous that's so embodied. And until recently, until the women's movement, I think it really had been lost as a numinous experience, except maybe in very secret ways. So I think for a lot of women, that was secretly such, or they had kind of lost their connection to the sacredness of it because there wasn't any respect for it in the culture. And childbirth, for example, was medicalized to such an extent that, you know, you were just kind of knocked out. So I think it's a very, very important thing for that in my lifetime I've seen women reclaim the sacredness of the birth-giving process and the child-rearing process, and men claim their place in it in a way that I think hasn't existed for thousands of years. But I also am glad that you get that my poetry is a path to divinity. I call the class I do Deep River. It's about writing as a spiritual practice, because for me, poetry is a spiritual practice. And to be able to get the spirit and the polis together is something that I'm always struggling with. And as I said in my, it feels numinous when I can get that to happen, even though you'd think the politics part of it wouldn't be so numinous, but it is for me. Yeah, Tom.
I was having a very politically incorrect thought. I was thinking of binders full of women, and then I was thinking, I wonder if a lot of Republican women don't share the same feeling you have about the sacredness of motherhood, and that they feel somehow it's been diluted in contemporary culture, and that in their own way, this is truly bipartisan actually, in their own way, and it may be very popular, in their own way, they may be, it's like Romney's wife and cooking and whatever, they're trying to put that forward. They've done a terrible job of it, but I suspect there's something of that feeling among women who identify as Republicans as well as women who identify as Democrats.
Well, Tom is saying he was having an politically incorrect thought about Republican women who might totally agree with what I was saying about the divinity of the motherhood experience. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of the anti-abortion movement comes precisely out of that. And that's why I have a lot of empathy, in a way, for the anti-abortion movement, even though I don't agree with it, because I don't think it should be legislated. But I think there is something very, very profound, and that, you know, there's a way in which the beloved mother, like, you know, the way that Romney talks about his wife, she's a goddess. You know, she's really divine. And I think he has that feeling for her, and I'm sure she has that feeling about her role. And that is to be honored and appreciated, I think. Yeah, Margaret. Thanks.
But I wanted to say something about this because I'm reminded of Michelle Obama and the convention.
Oh, wasn't she marvelous?
And Naomi also did. But there was something I've never seen a First Lady embody what she did and talk about, you know, it felt so sacred and so central to her that I was just moved to tears listening to that. I've never heard a First Lady talk like that.
I agree with you. Margaret is saying that at the convention, Michelle Obama did this magnificent job of embodying the goddess as the mother, and she called herself the mother-in-chief. And she, you know, and it was so powerful for so many of us, and she spoke with so much passion and so much agency. She wasn't some woman who belonged to a man. She belonged to herself, I think, really clearly, and she adored her husband, and she supported him, and she hadn't really particularly wanted him to be president because she thought, this is going to be a terrible time we're going to have, and she was right. But she spoke about how, in watching him develop, his psychological development she was talking about, she could see how essential it was not only for him as a person, but for the whole country. Anyway, thank you all very much, and come back in 15 minutes, and we'll hear Rick. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Rick Tarnas. I don't think Rick knows this, but he's actually the reason this whole program came together. When I was, are you not hearing me? Oh, sorry about that. We have to close the window. When we started realizing that we didn't have a plan for an election day conference or pre-election conference, as we have done so many times, and to me it seemed very, very important, I started thinking, well, what could we do? Bill Bradley wasn't available, so, you know, what were we going to do? And I thought, Rick Tarnas has offered to do something for this institute, and I've always wanted to hear him talk about astrology, and I've always wanted to know how he would talk about this moment. Let's do something that would include Rick Tarnas. And when I asked Rick and he said yes, we were ready to go. I think Rick is a man who gives eloquent expression to somebody who can combine the spirit of the depths and the spirit of the times. If you have read any of his work, his magnificent Passion of the Western Mind, which is a profound history of the Western mind and spirit, and his more recent book, Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview, which shines new light, often from an astrological point of view, on the unfolding drama of human history in our own critical age. his way of thinking and his way of being able to encompass those huge tugs between the times and the depths will stay with you and impress you as it has me. He's a philosopher and a cultural historian who established the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness doctoral program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which makes me want to go back and get a doctorate there, get a second doctorate. We have been very lucky at this institute that Rick has joined us by being a member at large of the Board of Governors at the Jung Institute of San Francisco for 6 years. And he's been for many years, how many years on our extended ed committee with, yeah, he's worked with Richard and Tom and me on extended ed. And it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for being willing to do this.
Good. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
We hear you loud and clear.
Great. I'll speak loud. We'll get my image off the screen here. So I thought I would begin first by just making the connection between what we just heard, that beautiful poetic evocation of not only our moment in history, but a reflection on a whole life's history as it feeds into this moment from Naomi. And Steve Zellman brought up the powerful passage from Aeschylus that Robert Kennedy mentioned at that absolutely crucial moment in our history when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and this was 2 months before Robert Kennedy died himself. And I remembered that passage, and we were trying to get it. I thought, well, I'll get the exact, so we can just share here what it was, because it was such an eloquent moment. And those of you who know something about Robert Kennedy's life, when John Kennedy was assassinated, I mean, the level of grief that Robert Kennedy went into was so profound that it was really a question of his sanity and whether he was going to keep living. And what carried him through ultimately, which he said many times, was poetry, which he went back to over and over again. And especially the Tennyson in memoriam played a big role, but it was especially Aeschylus. And that night, when he's speaking to this audience in Indianapolis, he didn't look down at his notes or anything. He just looked right into the faces of the people that were in the audience, and he said, I have had a brother that was killed too, and I know something of what you feel, and how you must feel about white people. And my brother was also killed by a white person. And then he said, I want to share with you something from my favorite poet, Aeschylus, and then the exact sentence that he quoted. Must have been a night like that with the sirens. He said, even in our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart. Even in our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. So that was and he just had that on the top of it because he had committed it to memory because it was kind of a center for him to get through the tremendous dark night of the soul, which really the whole nation and even a good part of the world went through in 1963, but of course was especially carried for him with very great poignancy. So I'm going to begin with a few remarks about the archetypal astrological perspective, which informs this presentation. And we know from a letter that Jung wrote to Freud in 1911 that as early as then, in 1911, he was very deeply engaged with the study of astrology, and that interest seems to have only increased over the decades. By the later 1940s and 50s, we know both from his letters and also from reports from his we're just letting the sirens go by here. Reports from his family members, particularly his daughter, who became an astrologer, partly to give, perhaps in large part, to be able to provide her father with the technical knowledge of the horoscopes that he wanted, but also from friends of the family, that astrology had become a kind of constant in his research and practice. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in the chapter that was weightily entitled Late Thoughts. So this is a man who's writing in his 80s, and in a late chapter of his autobiographical reflections, he has a chapter called Late Thoughts. I mean, a pretty gravitas kind of this poet. He wrote this this sentence. Our psyche is set up in accord with the structure of the universe, and what happens in the macrocosm likewise happens in the infinitesimal and most subjective reaches of the psyche. I think that statement expresses an understanding of the cosmos that could accommodate the astrological perspective that he was taking in, and in certain respects, you can see how I mean, this is really a Jungian restatement of that recognition of the anima mundi and of that sense of the microcosm of the human being a concrescence, a microcosm of the whole, of the macrocosm, as in this well-known image from the medieval period. But this was not an easy path to get to that point, because Jung was, I'm just giving a couple of few minutes of background on in a way, the philosophical, historical matrix of any discussion of astrology in our era, because Jung was a pioneer, in some respects the pioneer in the high culture of the 20th century in reconnecting us to that ancient source of disclosure from an ensouled cosmos. And Jung was, all through his life, was basically grappling with the fact that he was having all these experiences, paranormal experiences, experiences that were powerfully religious, but also these astrological correlations. They were happening in a cosmos, that a cosmology, a modern worldview that was radically disenchanted. And he identified himself very much as a scientist and an empirical physician and he was constantly holding that kind of tension of opposites. And the fact is that astrology shouldn't work in a random universe. He took that disenchanted universe seriously at the same time as he was having all these experiences that he also took seriously. So you can see why he was really working through tremendous philosophical and psychological and religious contradictions and paradoxes within him. I mean, he was wrestling with an angel that made him a much deeper person as a result. Here's a passage from the 1930s that captures his recognition of the disenchanted modern worldview. Since the stars have fallen from heaven and our highest symbols have paled, a secret life holds sway in the unconscious. That is why we have a psychology today and why we speak of the unconscious. All this would be quite superfluous in an age or culture that possessed the symbols. What you're seeing there is, sometimes when Jung, he could write in so many modes, but one of his modes was pretty poetically compact, and he could pack a lot into a phrase like, since the stars have fallen from heaven. He's capturing Nietzsche's God is dead, the destruction of the metaphysical, spiritual world that the modern mind has constellated, and he's also capturing the fall of the pre-Copernican ancient sacred heavens that carried the light and the meaning and the purpose of a higher telos in life that the fall of astrology brought with it in the wake of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So he's really carrying this in him. And in this particular passage, you can see that Jung is bemoaning the disenchantment of our culture. He said if it was just a decent culture, a culture that had a decent sense of symbol in its perception of the universe, a symbolic vision, we wouldn't have this problem. But as a result of that problem, depth psychology is a necessity. It's a compensation to the rationalist Enlightenment. It's a resurgence of the psychic depths. And he says this with his characteristic, that kind of, it's a kind of metaphysical or intellectual scorn that he can sometimes discharge when he is in that mood. And yet I want to remind us all here in this Jungian community or set of communities just how Jung was also aware that it was precisely this disenchantment of the cosmos, by which we mean the objectification of the world. The world is an object. It's not a subject. It's something that has been neutralized so that the human being can now exploit, manipulate, rationally comprehend it. And that objectification or neutralization, it breaks the spell of the participation mystique, and that makes possible depth psychology. In other words, depth psychology, which is in many ways this great, huge task of owning our projections, is tremendously empowered by the disenchantment of the cosmos, because the cosmos can now be seen as a neutral screen, and if we're reading things into it, then that's coming from our own need for meaning, our own psychic depths. As Edinger put it, the Copernican revolution couldn't have happened if Copernicus hadn't, in some sense, transcended the Earth and didn't identify with the Earth anymore so that he could see the Earth moving, instead of how the Earth is, because it looks like, if we're here, the Earth is certainly not moving. We're completely static, fixed at the center of the universe. It takes a transcendence of that subjectivity to get the Copernican revolution, which is the moment of the birth of modernity. Well, that, as Edinger says, is just what depth psychology permits as well. It's a Copernican revolution in the psyche. Jung saw this. And it involves a capacity to disidentify with our subjectivity sufficiently that we can recognize our projections. And so I'm wanting to just remind us how much that fact of that paradox of the role of the disenchanted universe in Jungian and depth psychology. It is simultaneously the ground that necessitated the birth of depth psychology with Nietzsche and Freud and Jung and William James and Anna O and Sabine Spielrein and Tony Wolff and so forth. But it also made it possible in a certain way. Anyway, that's another discussion. But as Jung's life evolved, progressed, his understanding of soul evolved, his understanding of the archetypes evolved, and he kept having experiences, which he eventually named synchronicities, that broke through the disenchanted, dualistic subject-object worldview, as he came to recognize that meaning seemed to be carried in the world itself apart from the human. It wasn't just a human interior reality. And that radically reconfigured the modern religious quest, which was now being contained by the universe and nature, not just the depths of the intrasubjective psyche. This is a huge move by Jung. That's why he worked so hard on bringing synchronicity into the intellectual discourse of during the last 15 years of his life. And this gave him a frame of reference within which he could also understand how astrology worked. I should say synchronicity itself remains a mystery, and the term is not an explanation, as Jung recognized, but it is the naming of a phenomenon that liberates. It's a phenomenon widely observed by human beings. By naming it, it frees up that phenomenon from the need to explain it in terms of mechanistic causation. It allows the phenomenon to be observed and to exist without reductionism. And that's a great shift, because otherwise they're just looked as mere coincidences. But as the philosopher of science, Percy Bridgman, once said, coincidences are what you have left over after you've applied a bad theory. We here in this room have a lot of synchronicities that we've observed, and then the astrological data provides us with this vast range of extraordinary synchronicities of correlations between the movements of the heavens, of the planetary alignments, and the archetypal dynamics of the human psyche. If those are all just coincidences, then we've applied a bad theory. So now, most contemporary astrological researchers tend to understand astrological correlations in terms of synchronicity today. It is, rather than some kind of linear mechanistic causation coming from the planets, the clock is not causing it to be 5 after 3 right now. It is reflecting that. I think the most elegant description of astrology's symbolic reading of the cosmos and how the cosmos could possibly support not just a projection of meaning onto it, but support it with as an authentic correlation of above and below psyche and cosmos, came from the great classical philosopher Plotinus, who wrote, "The stars are like letters which inscribe themselves at every moment in the sky. Everything in the world is full of signs. All events are coordinated. All things depend on each other. As has been said, everything breathes together." I think that's also an excellent description of synchronicity itself. Everything breathes together. Remember breath, of course, all the background meanings of breath, and anima and ruah and spirit and so forth. Now, in our age, astrology is still so far outside the accepted paradigm boundary line. It's so much the stone rejected by the builders, and Jung recognized that. Even though he quite bravely talked about it in his books, he didn't disclose anywhere near as much as he was actually using it. And I think for very good reasons, subsequent generations of Jungians were very cautious about how much they discussed or the use of astrology or explored it even, because, I mean, can you imagine what the Freudian psychoanalysts would have done with that if they were in their paradigm war? But I think, I mean, in an age in which astrology is basically the gold standard of superstition in our culture, anyone with a good 20th century education, which I think would obviously involve everybody that's in this room who has heard these extraordinary presentations today, I think it takes direct evidence from one's own research that alone can make a difference and shift the paradigm and have an experience that is basically something like this here on the screen, that kind of classic woodcut of breaking into a new universe, the kind of classic paradigm shift illustration. I know that was true for me. I just had no inkling that astrology could have the least validity, and in fact it was a Jungian professor at Harvard who, in a conversation with me, started talking about astrology, and I thought he'd taken leave of his senses, and I just steered our conversation back to more interesting to me discussion of Freud and Jung and European ideas and so forth. And it wasn't until several years later when I went to Esalen Institute and lived there for 10 years and worked particularly with Stanislav Grof, and Joe Campbell and others, but it was particularly the research with Stan Grof that we discovered, much to our astonishment, how precisely the correlations between the planetary movements in the sky with respect to people's natal charts, their birth charts or horoscopes, correlated with the specific archetypal qualities of their experiences at that time. We are particularly looking at very powerful shifts in consciousness, non-ordinary states of consciousness, LSD sessions, spiritual emergencies, psychotic breaks, the potent, deep transformations that often were triggered by people who were going through workshops at Esalen and so forth. So we had this extraordinary kind of laboratory there. And it was quite powerful to take in the correlations until finally Stan came to, as he put it, he regarded it as really as a kind of Rosetta Stone of the psyche. And since then, the research has continued for years here at CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, where I teach with Brian Swim, Stan Grof, Charlene Stretnack, David Ulansey, who's been here in the past. He was here there for years. That's become a kind of central interest in our scholarly community, and there's an archetypal research collective of about 70 students, alums, and faculty whose research I'll be, in some respect, basically drawing upon in my presentation. Most of the early research was very much focused on individual psychology, and personal experiences, individual biographies, but later it expanded to include collective historical phenomena, the big planetary cycles, tracing the archetypal patterns and dynamics of cultural history in the collective psyche across the centuries. Now, just a couple of basic principles by which I want to sort of frame what I'm saying in terms of, principles of the research program, so to speak, the paradigm. It's basically a Pythagorean, Platonic, Keplerian, Johannes Kepler, the great astrologer, astronomer of the late Renaissance, who his particular, his focus particularly on the geometrical, the moving geometry of meaning of the cyclical alignments of the planets. So that's where the action seems to be. And as Jung said, there seems to be a fundamental connection between specific archetypal principles and the specific planets and the sun and moon. And that focus on the planets and what are called aspects, integrated with a Jungian archetypal transpersonal depth psychology, is the basic frame of reference that we have found most kind of valuable and fruitful. Dane Rudhyar was certainly the crucial link in the 20th century between those two lineages. Now, the big action. Maybe there's one thing I should say before we go to the description of the planets that we'll be especially focused on. One is that it's very important, I think everybody in this room with their sensitivity to symbolic multivalence can appreciate the fact that the kind of astrological understanding that I'm sharing here is one that is not concretely predictive. It's archetypally predictive. That is, it gives you a sense for the larger, let's put it in musical terms, the larger chordal structures of our lives. Chordal structures being like these powerful archetypal patterns, structures, essences, complexes of meanings and images and affect, impulses. But what melodies we sing to those chordal structures, that's up to us. What genres, whether it's classical or rock and roll or jazz or hip hop or Indian or whatever. So actually, these are good examples of the cultural complex, taking the larger, the archetypal dimension and then inflecting it each in particular ways. And that multivalence of the archetypal principles is specifically what gives space for the autonomy of the individual with that crucial spark of potential freedom in how we dance with these very powerful archetypal forces. And in some sense, this can give us a greater capacity to have more consciousness of these otherwise unconscious forces. In that sense, this kind of depth astrology is a continuation of depth psychology in that basic project of helping to make the unconscious more conscious, or to open up a dialogue between conscious and unconscious for a more fruitful and less problematic life. We co-creatively participate in these, and each of these great archetypal principles have, of course, the potential for noble as well as ignoble, light and shadow, trivial and profound possibilities, creative or destructive. Now, the major alignment of our time, it's the outer planets, first of all, Jupiter to some extent, but particularly from there on, Saturn, Jupiter, Saturn, even more so, and Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Those outer planetary bodies are the ones that, first of all, we have the most, there's basically a universal consensus among all practicing astrologers who study the outer planets as well as the ancient ones known to the ancient. there's universal consensus about all their meanings out there, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And we also have the greatest empirical kind of database for these this consensus. And in our time, it happens that the major alignment or aspect, as it is called, that is in some sense shaping the underlying gestalt of the collective psyche is the Uranus-Pluto alignment, a square between Uranus and Pluto. These do not happen very frequently. This is the very first time these two planets have come into what's called dynamic alignment or hard aspect since the 1960s, when they were in conjunction from 1960 to 1972. Okay, so they were in conjunction from 60 to 72, these two planets, and they moved into square, the very next big aspect for them, between starting in 2007 approximately, and will go right through 2020. Uranus, basically, of course, it's discovered in the modern era, and if I can just say, to give you basic headline sense for its meaning, its significance, it has been clearly recognized as associated with a principle, an archetypal principle of sudden change, of awakening, of liberation, of disruption, rebellion, the sudden breakthrough, cultural changes, rebellions, breakthroughs, technological impulse very strong. There's an unpredictable quality to it. It's a trickster archetype in a very fundamental way. The flash of the new, of the unexpected, the liberation from and defiance of the old order. And archetypally or mythically, it's clearly connected to the Prometheus archetype, the great rebel and the Titan rebel and liberator, and its creative principle, who gave fire, which is both a symbol of technological breakthrough, but also cultural, even spiritual fire of awakening that comes with, and he was a trickster. And basically everything that we know about Uranus is connected, embodied in the myth of Prometheus. And when Uranus was discovered in 1781, it was in fact discovered right at the heart of the period of Prometheus Unbound. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, Romanticism, kings and aristocracies and old church structures being toppled, and the awakening of the creative individual genius, you know, the Beethoven, the Goethe, and so forth. It was this is the Promethean impulse, and Pluto, discovered in 1930, is carrying this powerful principle of basically the instinctual underworld of the psyche and of nature and of civilization. It's what Freud called the id, the instincts, the broiling cauldron of the instincts. It's what Nietzsche called the will to power, Schopenhauer's will, the Darwinian evolutionary impulse that is always overcoming itself, and the Ouroboros thrust of transformation, destruction, and regeneration. In a way, we have to go even past the Greek mythic, Dionysus, Pluto, Hades, that triumvirate captures it to a great extent, but we also need to go to India to get Pele, of course, in Hawaii, but India, with its understanding of Kali and of the Kundalini serpent, is very much capturing, and Shiva is the destroyer who also is ultimately, like Kali, that which mediates rebirth. And all that is in this Plutonic very powerful volcanic principle, Dionysian. Now when these two come together into alignment, basically they move into mutual archetypal activation. So in a sense, Pluto is volcanically driving and empowering whatever it touches to overwhelming degree. In this case, this Promethean impulse towards radical change, accelerated change, rebellion, revolution, and technological advance, sexual experiment. I mean, the sexual particularly comes from the Plutonic, the id, the instincts, but are liberated by the Promethean Uranian principle. It's every periods that have these two planets in alignment are consistently periods as we go through history. This 1960s, early 70s, 72 is the last conjunction, but if you go back, the conjunction before that was the mid-1840s to early mid-1850s, when, of course, you had the 1848 revolutions that swept through every capital in Europe, but also in India, in China, in the Ottoman Empire. They were happening right across the board, and of course, this is also a period of the emergence of the women's emancipation and the women's suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement reaching a peak that Harriet Beecher Stowe's powerful Uncle Tom's Cabin that helped set in motion, as Lincoln said, the Civil War. Literature, music, I mean, Wagner's music. I mean, if you had the Rolling Stones and Hendrix in the 60s, you had Wagner in the 1840s and 50s. And if you go to the opposition, it's the big axial alignments. Like, so the one just before that, which was the full moon version of it, the opposition of Uranus and Pluto, 1787 to 1798, French Revolutionary epoch. Again, I mean, it's the birth of Mary Wollstonecraft, great manifesto, vindication of the rights of women. That's the beginning of the abolitionist movement. It's, of course, revolution is just sweeping Europe, starting with the Bastille, but really covering Europe, and even Haiti, the revolution there. And you have as well, you've got Beethoven. I'm sure Vienna experienced Beethoven playing the piano in 1790s, blowing their minds with just the power. Listen to the Appassionata Sonata. Nothing's like it when he's coming in there. I'm sure it's what the people in London were feeling in 1966 when Hendrix started playing guitar there. It would have just totally expanded their sense of the possible on those. So it's this plutonic, volcanic potency, but it's also this Promethean liberation, emancipatory impulse, and also a kind of creative novelty that's coming through, and very disruptive. And because the plutonic is also the shadow of the underworld too, there's a lot of heat, violence that's potential there, as clearly emancipation and violence were wedded in the French Revolution with tremendous impact. Again, in the 60s, think about all the peace movement demonstrations that overflowed into violence. So there's it can go both ways. In general, what we're looking at is two different types of patterns: synchronic patterns, where simultaneously in many different countries at once and in many different fields of human experience at once, there are the same archetypal energies being empowered and coming through in concrete ways. So at the same time that you're having the March on Washington with Martin Luther King, you're having the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and the catalyzing of the women's movement. And at the same time that's happening, the Rolling Stones are starting to, they record their first album, and the Beatles, and Tim Leary is taking acid at Harvard, and Nelson Mandela and the Black Liberation Movement in South Africa is happening. I mean, it's just right across the board in different fields of human activity. So you're getting a synchronic clustering of identical archetypal energies inflected in specific ways according to what culture or field is being activated. At the same time, you're getting this other pattern, which is diachronic, which is across time. Every time these two planets come into dynamic alignment, like the conjunction, the opposition, which are like the new moon and the full moon of each cycle, and then the square, which is halfway in between. Those are the so-called hard aspects or dynamic aspects. And each time they come into alignment, we see the activation of these energies synchronically across many fields, many countries, but they are coherently connected to the last time and the previous time that they were in alignment, so that there is a diachronic patterning and a kind of evolutionary cumulative quality. Let me give you an example. The biggest Uranus-Pluto, the last conjunction, the 60s, let's say the biggest three social movements in the United States were the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the youth counterculture, those three. Now let's just take the very next time that those two planets came into aspect, the very next presidential election that those two planets came into aspect after 1972. See, 72 was when George McGovern lost to Nixon. That was the last time that young people were really active in a presidential election until 2008. It's just like, it's not that it goes totally underground, but it's just like it comes in these kind of pulsing waves. People do different things in between with the energies, and sometimes it's kept more alive. But clearly there was a, whether it was the kids from Haight-Ashbury going up to Marin County or out into the nature, into the communes in the rural area, or to Wall Street. Clearly there was a kind of a waveform that happened and then came up again clearly in this last election, which is the first one under this new Uranus-Pluto alignment. And who were the most significant presidential candidates for most of the campaign? It was a woman, Hillary Clinton, and an African American, Barack Obama. At no time between the last time Uranus and Pluto were in conjunction, 60s, early 70s, until now, was a woman and an African American at such a, those were made possible by that social revolution. But everybody had that feeling like something, it's as if something that had been seeded back then was coming to into manifestation in such a precious way that everyone was weeping at Grant Park, which again was like 40 years later in this kind of numinous event. Okay, so here, just for your, these are the what are called the major aspects, and it's the ones on your left, the conjunction, the two squares, and the opposition, which are again the new moon, the full moon, and the two quarter moons halfway between. That's where the action is. That's where the big events take place, where there's a kind of dynamic tension and concressing of the potential. And by the soft aspects on the right, they're especially significant. I mean, they're important in collective history are what are called world transits, but they're especially significant in natal charts and individual transits, but they don't have the same kind of dynamic impact and concrete manifestation as the hard aspects. Okay, so I want to play you just the very beginning of, this is just to give you a little taste of the kinds of energies that we in our period are dealing with right now. This was BBC, we'll just watch it for just the very beginning of it, BBC capturing of, on January 1st, 2011, the beginning of 2011, this is before the Arab Spring it was like just before, but 24 countries were having major demonstrations at the moment that, and were, as you'll see, erupting.
More than 20,000 people took to the streets to demand calls for early elections after the country's deputy prime minister resigned over an alleged corruption scandal. Chanting, "Get out, get out." Some of the protesters overturned cars and torched vehicles. Others hurled rocks at police.
Jobless teenagers and young men had running battles with police in the Algerian capital.
Okay, so this goes on to show, as Albania, Algeria, Argentina, goes on to show Australia, Bangladesh, Belgium, Canada, Chile. You had to be paying attention to the world news carefully, like how many were erupting already. Chile, Cuba, Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, of course, Honduras, India, Ireland, Israel, Italy. Remember the women's movements, where the women's huge demonstrations in Italy, Jordan, Tunisia, which was the trigger point just within the month after this was made, Turkey, United Kingdom, Venezuela, Yemen. This is an example. I mean, you could have looked at that and thought, this is 1968. That quality of it's happening in Paris, it's happening in Berkeley, it's happening in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's happening in New York, in Mexico City. So here's Tahrir Square in Egypt, carrying a kind of epicenter of this tremendous sense of revolutionary potential in the air. Here's just so you get in the 60s. This is the two planets moving together, Uranus and Pluto, from approximately 60 to 72 is when they're within what seems to be the active orb of influence, 15 degrees. From 60 to 72 when they're exact in the mid-60s. Here, of course, Martin Luther King, incredible day in Washington, 28th of August, 1963. And then here, just capturing also the eruption of the plutonic cauldron as well, and the instinctual violence that can, I mean, think of the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the 60s, much more vivid example. Here's the Bastille. To give you a sense of synchronicity at work and the constellating of an archetypal complex simultaneously in totally unrelated parts of the planet. When the Bastille was happening, spring, summer of 1789, that's when, on the other side of the world, completely unrelated no communication possible. In Tahiti, that's when the mutiny on the Bounty is taking place. The mutiny on the Bounty with, Fletcher Christian, and so the most famous maritime rebellion and the most famous political revolution happening simultaneously. It's an example of an archetypal complex getting simultaneously constellated. The Rolling Stones, well, I think I started at 1:45. So let me just do, here's this, let's see, because we want to have a little time for Q&A. So I'll do about 3 more minutes. Here's the Stones giving the, no, we won't. So think about Street Fighting Man, how the Stones are singing. Everywhere I hear the sound of marching, charging feet, and then they go to not beyond the present moment, to the historical, and say, the time is right for palace revolution. I shout and scream, I kill the king. I rail at all his servants. He's connecting to like the French Revolution, the British Revolution, under earlier Uranus-Pluto alignments, 1640s and 50s, 1780s. And then he even gets to the archetypal level where he says, my name is called disturbance. I'm the very principle of this eruption. Now, the big thing that's been going on the last 3 years is that Saturn, 3 to 4 years, is that Saturn has been in a T-square with Uranus and Pluto. This is to help us get a grasp of the tremendous polarization of energies between 2008 and just really through 2011 very potently, but still spilling over to this last summer. Saturn was in what's called a T-square with Uranus and Pluto. Very rare T-square. It only, between 1929 and 33 was the last time it happened. And the time before that was 1873 to 76. And those three those are the last, of course, 1929 to 33 is the last time that there was a massive economic collapse across the world. When Saturn opposes Uranus, that typically is when there's sudden collapses of structures, and when Pluto's in the T-square with it, it tends to be very, very potent. And then, in addition, you have the time before that was 1873 to 76, which was the last time that there was a global stock market crash, which many economic historians have called attention to. Is this one going to be more like the 1870s long depression, as it was called, or the Great Depression of the 30s, the Great Recession we have now? But what I also want to give you a sense for, of course, the archetypal meaning of Saturn, the limit, the ruler, the senex principle, the contraction, constriction, authority, conservatism, etc. You get those two lined up in opposition, and it's like senex and puer are in ruler and rebel are both superpowered and in intense conflict. So you get both a massive collapse of structures, but also an empowerment of very conservative forces and the forces of change at the same time. And it's really potent. The mid-60s is when Saturn was last opposite Uranus, 64 to 68. And again, I mean, so much of the culture wars of that period that began then have been played out these last several years with this kind of. Well, I'll just move quickly just to the, that's an example of the T-square, the tsunami, climate, extreme climate, of course the Japanese experience of the nuclear meltdown and the tsunami and the earthquake all at once, and the new radical uncertainty of modern life is clearly reflected in this. I won't be able to show you this. This would be have been a moment of comic relief, but you know, it's 3 minutes. Why don't I let you watch this, It's really, really cool. And then we'll go into our, this is, of course, it went viral. Saturn opposite Uranus, just as the two of those planets came into tight alignment in 2008, when you're getting this Senex-Puer opposition in the presidential election between the very old McCain, conservative white Republican, and the very young African-American liberal Obama, and the crash is happening. And this Saturn opposite Uranus happened right on Louis C.K.'s son, and he became somehow listen to this dialogue, and it's one of the most comically intense creative renderings of this particular archetypal constellation you could ever hear. This is Louis C.K., who's the a splendid contemporary comic, and of course he's on the Conan O'Brien show. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say, by way of, I just figured a little trickster lightheartedness. I think one could just, our political crisis is a crisis of vision and a crisis of will. In a sense, I see it as a kind of radical assertion of the part over the whole, against the whole. It's a kind of hypertrophic, undeveloped, heroic ego, deaf to the larger community of being, in all those ways that Tom brought up with the different cultural complexes that aren't listening to, whether it's the environment or the poor or other people, or the need for individual self-aggrandizement. It's deaf to the larger community of being, and it's blind to its own shadow. And I think what we can see in many ways is that we're at a kind of, really a kind of initiatory moment of transformation, and this T-square that we're just coming out of, and this rest of this decade with this tremendous Promethean, Dionysian, Plutonic thrust into the unknown is a kind of eye of the needle and threshold of transformation that has great uncertainty built into it. And as Tom and I discussed years ago, uncertainty is absolutely necessary for an initiatory transformation. You can't have a pretend near-death experience. It has to have gravitas. It has to be urgent and grave, because that's what reconfigures moral values. And that's where I think we are right now. Okay, thanks. And then, maybe just a couple of questions. I don't want to take time from the larger group. Any quick thoughts or questions, please?
Well, an observation is that part of the myth of Uranus is that his son, Saturn, rebelled against him because he would rape his mother, Gaia, every night.
Yeah, Uranus, as the sky god, was rebelled against by his son. I'm repeating it for the rebelled against the sky god on Gaia's behalf to protect her from the rapaciousness of Uranus. Okay, a quick response to that is Uranus was named Uranus as a planet as part of the, in a way, by rationalist astronomers who were saying Uranus is the father of Kronos, who is the father of Jupiter, who's the father of Mars and Venus, etc. So there's like a patrilineal sequence in the planets. But when astrologers started really studying carefully what was going on at the time of Uranus transits and in natal charts, it was clear that it was connected to this impulse of rebellion rather than resistance to rebellion, and of change, and of this impulse for the new. The shadow side of the Prometheus archetype, however, is precisely this kind of technological genius assertion of the rebel against the whole in some ways. This is what we're holding, is that tension, and Prometheus is in certain ways the god of modern man, and the Greek thrust and so forth. And there's James Hillman once said to me, Prometheus had to be bound because he didn't believe in any other gods. And so that's the immature Prometheus. There's different levels of Prometheus. But anyway, just to unpack that a little bit. Any other thoughts or comments, and then I'll give it over to Naomi. Please.
Just a request of you, because of your big vision. Is this just a conflict, or is it an initiation into a new level of culture?
Oh, I'm glad the question was, is this just a conflict that we're looking at, or is it an initiation into a genuinely new level? I really see this as a potential opening of, clearly the Earth is in a mortal crisis of the Earth community, carried by humanity and by a particular part of humanity into this crucible of an initiatory transformation. And the possibility of opening up to a reconnection to the whole of being is in some sense being both required and at the same time made possible by where we are right now. I just came from the Pioneers Conference of 3,000 people who are just right at the cutting edge of ecological, spiritual, social justice. And there are a lot of young people out there who are carrying this baton from us with great courage and intelligence and hope. And they're also happening to be going to Halloween parties tonight. It's cool. But I have a lot of, I don't have a naive optimism about it, but I have a lot of faith in the larger spirit of the whole that carries forward in our younger generation, and Naomi was invoking her grandchild in that spirit. Okay, I'm going to give it over to Naomi. Thank you.
So Ryan, do you have questions from the webinar?
Yes, we do. You should have 3 of them there. I believe Jessica brought them down.
Oh, okay. Here we are. Oh, sorry. I think I got it backwards. Better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, there's one question, and I think maybe all of us can respond to this. With a history of deception, many folks do not trust any candidates in the election. Is there any way that the trust of the American people can be earned again? Who would like to take that one on? Tom?
The question of trust reminds me of the image that I used called Rumor from 1943, in which the collective psyche gains its energy by sort of snaking through the community and drawing all of the concerns of individuals into its eyes and ears and serpentine tongue, and it fills the community with suspicion. And the question, I would agree with that there's lots of reason for profound distrust and suspicion of our politicians and of our newspapers and media. It does feel as though we're being fed canned stories by specific interests who want us to do something or not do something. So I'm all for a healthy
level of trust and distrust and suspicion. On the other hand, at some point, I do believe that you have to place your trust in the people that speak to you. Now, of course, Romney speaks to some people and Obama speaks to other people. Obama happens to speak to me, and although he didn't deliver on everything he promised, I tend to put my trust in him because I think he's an intelligent man who's been obstructed. These, what I call cultural complexes, are so intractable. The idea that any one person or even one party can shift the direction of a whole country in 4 years is, of course, absurd. And that's precisely what Romney is promising, that he's going to shift the direction of the whole country in 4 years. He's going to give us 12 million new jobs and lower the deficit and lower taxes and spend $2 trillion more on the Army, military. So my response is, I think you can't let the rumor beast and the suspicion and distrust that it spreads take over your individual psyche. Your individual psyche needs to make its own judgments about what you see and experience and feel, and then you have to put your money on the table. You have to bet. You know, you have to vote, and you have to do something about what you care about. That was a speech.
That was a speech. Thank you. Okay, the second question is, social networking has been engulfed with political ads from politicians as well as our friends and family. Negative ads make up the bulk of them. Why is negative campaigning so popular? Again, I want to take that on, Richard?
Well, what the spin doctors tell us is that it works. And that's a sad commentary on the collective psyche, but it seems that hate is a stronger emotion than love, at least in the contemporary political arena. And I want to go back to what the previous question and just say something about that from the point of view of Sri Aurobindo. He was not at all naive about destructive demonic influences in the human psyche and beyond. And in India, they don't talk about Satan or the devil. There are 4 great asuras, who are the demons of the vital mind, that level of the mind that we use to regulate our life. And he said that in our time, in the 20th century, when he was speaking, the greatest asura is falsehood. And we're living, and we have been living progressively in a more and more sophisticated world of falsehood, where the mind and the technology all come together, the polling, the manipulation of subgroups, to influence us in a way. And I think in terms of our own trust, it's practicing truth in our own lives that gives us the discrimination to see what's truth and what's lie.
Well, the third question and the last is, do you think that race or financial status come into play more than the political issues themselves in some areas of the U.S.? And I thought I would start that and then throw it to Rick with a question to him about it. I have been shocked at how there's such an underlying racism that's going on all the time. You hear the code for it constantly. But it's not named directly in the way that it was in the 60s. And the thing that blows my mind, and somebody was talking about it earlier, we can't talk about poverty anymore, and everybody identifies like they're going to get rich. You know, they're going to be one of the 1%, but that's the great American promise, is to do that. And the question I have for Rick is, how do you think about that given the shift from the 60s with this Uranus and Pluto struggle going on, and the shift in that, you know, how it's changed?
One of the things to keep in mind about the Plutonic is that it does include, in a way, the vilest instinctual energies, the shadow energies that can erupt in the mob, or in the person who gets drunk and starts spewing racist, vile things and would not dream of saying it in his sober state. It's there. It's in the depths, and that gets activated too. That gets liberated in very problematic ways. Yes, it is shocking to see the extent of that kind of racism that exists. But think about the reality. There was no way in the 60s, as idealistic as we were, there was no way that there was two little African-American girls running around in the White House as their home with their African-American parents as the President and First Lady. This is a personal conviction that I know Obama has stated, and he's drawing it from Martin Luther King, that the arc of the universe moves towards justice slowly, and he's taking that from a transcendentalist in the 19th century. Martin Luther King took it from a transcendentalist so yes, it's terribly too slow, but no matter what we may have reservations about with, say, how Obama has fulfilled our realistic and unrealistic expectations of him, nevertheless, his very becoming of president is a revolutionary act that totally changes history. And on the day after his election, a French woman columnist said, the United States has, with this event, seized the moral torch of humanity, and it behooves us in Europe to pay attention. It's something. I mean, yes, it's not as everything that we want, but and it activates terrible racist shadow who feel helpless against this progress that's happening. Nevertheless, it happened.
Thank you so much, Rick. That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Ryan in Asheville, and all of you on the webinar for being with us today.
And thank you so much. It really was wonderful. We had a wonderful time, and we're very happy to have done this with you.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Have a great day.